A pensioner's body is discovered hidden in a house in Wales.
He said, "I've done something terrible. I've killed my neighbour."
He has been beaten, robbed and strangled.
He strangled him with a television power flex cable.
The house is the last known residence of David Cook, a convicted murderer out on life licence. Cook has been hiding for 12 days when he tells his probation officer where to find the body. Having served 22 years for the murder of a Sunday school teacher, Cook kills again. Why was he ever released? And could this tragedy have been prevented? 1 in 5 murders in the UK is now committed by an ex-prisoner. From serial rapists...
He harboured dark thoughts about carrying out sexual offences.
...to convicted killers.
They'd met in prison, they were out on the streets together.
Free to walk amongst us.
They knew he could have killed again.
Free to murder innocent people.
She stabbed him many times, and then she hid him in a wheelie bin.
I'm Donald McIntyre, and I'm examining how such tragedies happen. Who's to blame? Is it the justice system? Or are these killers just pure evil?
She gained pleasure from hurting people.
And ultimately, could an innocent life have been saved? This is Release to Kill. David Cook is born in South Wales, 1947. Little is known about his early life. He marries and has a daughter who he last sees when she's 5 years old.
We know that he grew up in South Wales in the 1950s. Now, actually, there was quite a lot of deprivation, financial deprivation in that area during that time.
Cook is a thief from an early age. He's charged with burglary from a hotel and soon graduates to breaking and entering. It's not long before he turns violent.
David Cook's MO was similar throughout his career. He used to break into property, use as much violence as he needs to on the victim, and then steal money.
By 1980, he's living in Reading, Berkshire, with no fixed abode, when he's tried for the first in a series of aggravated robberies. In one attack, he breaks into a house, wakes up a sleeping couple, ties them up and gags them at knife point before stealing cash.
Cook had gone in there armed with a knife, which makes it aggravated burglary. And to be honest, they're kind of rare offences of burglary because there's far more risk to enter premises when people are sleeping than to enter a premises where there's nobody there. But he deliberately chose to enter premises where people were sleeping in their beds.
In another aggravated burglary, his terrified victim is an 80-year-old man.
David Cook broke into property belonging to a vulnerable person and threatened him, gagged him, and stole his money.
When working with individuals who target elderly or vulnerable individuals, often people talk about that just being easier. You're much more likely to encounter resistance if you're stealing from somebody who's physically equal or potentially stronger than you.
Even though he appears to pick vulnerable victims, Cook himself is physically strong and enjoys weightlifting.
He was larger than life in terms of his physique. His demeanour was such that it bordered on arrogance.
We can certainly frame him within the context of an antisocial personality disorder. The way they view the world as sort of a dog-eat-dog world. He sees an opportunity to meet his needs and he takes that opportunity. So he doesn't really think about those who he may hurt along the way.
His aggravated burglaries land Cook in Reading Prison. At that time, a local Category B prison.
Most Category B prisons are also local prisons, so that's where he would have been on remand. He would have gone out to court in the morning as a remand prisoner. He comes back at night as a convicted prisoner.
While in prison, Cook strikes up a correspondence with a pen pal after responding to an ad in a Christian magazine.
There's lots of schemes. The pen pals will be trained what to write and what not to write, and they are, having seen some of pen pal letters, they need to be kind of very impersonal.
Cook's pen pal is Reading resident Beryl Maynard, a devout born-again Christian who believes that the gospel can save inmates from a life of crime.
You obviously need to know who the person is that they're writing to, so you don't tell them your life story and what's going on and where you live and all of that type of thing.
But Beryl takes her charitable work very seriously. She also visits her correspondents in jail.
She was a gentle, loving person who wanted to help others, including David Cook.
Beryl would not have known that Cook was a violent offender.
If a pen pal asked for an individual's conviction or thing, they wouldn't give it, and they probably would be deemed not suitable to be a pen pal.
In 1987, Cook is released from prison and tracks down his old pen pal, Beryl. He arranges to meet her outside her local church. The meeting goes well, and she has no reason to be afraid of someone she's been writing to so regularly. Beryl is confident enough in her opinion of Cook to invite him for dinner at the family home in Pitcroft Avenue. She doesn't suspect for a minute that Cook is just manipulating her.
David Cook's intention in visiting the house was, I'm convinced, to carry out a recce so he could gain from the family financially.
David Cook appears to be motivated by greed and uses excessive force to get what he wants. But is someone like this always looking for what they can get out of a person? Former psychiatrist Professor Taj Nathan and former prison governor Vanessa Frague are in the Crime Hub with me to discuss the case. When I look at the offences for which he was convicted early on, violent burglaries, it doesn't seem to me as if violence and burglary always went hand in hand. I think that wasn't necessarily his MO.
No, so in terms of his motive, it seems that he was driven by the desire for material gain, so the desire for money.
But he did go with the intent of possibly causing violence, because he took with him a Stanley knife and a carving knife. So although he may not have actually used those knives, the intent could have been there to use the knives if required.
Is there much support or rehabilitation available for burglars like Mr. Cook?
He certainly would have been interviewed within the prison system to find out if there were any areas of concern that could be addressed whilst he was in custody. It might be that there wasn't anything that they could have done, that he enjoyed the act of burglaring others. He liked the thrill of going into somebody's house and seeing what he could get away with.
So he engages with a pen pal scheme. How did you view them and how did they operate?
Well, there's an awful lot of prisoners who have no ties with the outside world, no family or no friends, etc. So the prison pen pal scheme, it was a scheme where people would write into prisoners. It was kept very professional. They just converse with letters backwards and forwards.
It provides the function of socialising the inmates, keeping them in contact, and by and large it appears to be a pretty beneficial engagement.
Yes, I would agree. So in most cases it can increase the likelihood of social reintegration when the individual leaves prison. In this case, I think it served a different purpose. So
he appeared to attach himself to Beryl, who was Christian, who wanted to be open, and in many ways she was vulnerable. And does this reflect upon his previous victims?
Yes, I think it's likely that it does. I think he is likely to have been identifying victims that were vulnerable in some way to coercion.
And here we have a case where he goes to dinner with her, he knows a lot about her now and the family, and so what was supposed to be, you know, an altruistic dinner, sharing support, ended up effectively he was casing the joint.
Mm-hmm. So her generous altruistic gesture was exploited.
David Cook has wormed his way into the trust of a good Samaritan who's trying to help him change his life. He's about to betray that trust in the most brutal way. Cook visits the Maynard family home on multiple occasions, gradually working his way into their confidence.
Beryl Maynard and her family were not aware of David Cook's previous convictions and therefore had no reason to feel that they were in any danger.
By November 1987, just a few months after leaving prison, David Cook is once again in debt. He decides robbing Beryl is the answer to his problems. He deliberately calls around when she's home alone. She lets him in, having no inkling of his terrible intentions.
David Cook entered the Maynard family home. He threatened Beryl Maynard with a knife.
Cook tells Beryl he needs money desperately, using the knife to make clear he intends to take it by force. During the course of his robbery, he forces her upstairs to find more money. Then Cook strangles Beryl with the cord of a dressing gown and flees.
David Cook's motive was purely to gain money. He was evil. He was ruthless. He was callous and extremely devious. He was just wicked.
Beryl's body is found by her husband, a postman, when he returns home from work. Led by Detective Inspector Eddie Garland, police initially have few clues.
It didn't appear to be a forced entry to the premises, and neither was the house ransacked. We carried out door-to-door inquiries, as well as questioning the family, and it became evident fairly early on that we were looking for David Cook.
Beryl Maynard is brutally and tragically killed. Now the police must find the evidence to connect the murder with chief suspect David Cook.
We carried out intelligence checks, criminal record checks, and it was apparent that his MO for the murder was exactly the same as previous robberies.
Detective Inspector Garland circulates Cook's details to every police department nationwide.
It was only after a few days that he actually walked into Reading Police Station, where he gave himself up.
In Reading Crown Court, Cook's defence is that it was manslaughter and that he never intended to kill Beryl. He tries to shift the blame onto Beryl, claiming that when they got upstairs, she spun around and scratched his eye. The jury does not believe Cook's version of events.
The jury took just 2 hours to come to a decision, which is very quick. David Cook was convicted of the murder of Beryl Maynard and sentenced to life imprisonment.
Cook is once again sent to Reading Prison.
I felt at the time that the public will be protected from Cook's activities in the future.
Cook has committed a terrible murder, but were there signs that he would escalate from violent burglaries to killing? It's quite a jump to go from, you know, tying somebody up, committing a robbery, and then to actually strangle somebody, kill them.
He may have got some sort of power kick from the actual murder. And it seems to me that he is almost a bully. Well, he is a bully. And his lack of empathy and his clear disregard for any feelings of the victims is evident.
I wonder, there but for the grace of God, would any of his previous victims before this offence been murdered?
Particularly the victim that was 80 years old, you know, who was equally bound and gagged and threatened with a knife.
In previous robberies, he stole from houses where he was unknown to the victim. In this case, he was known to the victim. There must have been an absolute guarantee that she would identify him, and therefore he must have known that there was only one way out of this, and that is to kill.
Well, that's right, and that may account for his actions on this occasion. His homicidal actions is that it was to avoid detection.
But that still doesn't add up. What I'm trying to say is the pathology may even be greater because, is that it was his choice to go into the house with the victim in it rather than, as a professional burglar could reasonably have waited for it to pop out of the shops.
Yes, and a burglar with less violent tendencies, that's what they would do. They would purposefully watch the house, make sure the house was empty, and go in and burgle. And interestingly, he's already been in the house, so he knows what's in the house. He was aware of her movements. He was aware of what she did, her comings and goings, what her husband did.
So if he wanted to rob the house and she wasn't there, he could easily have done that.
Absolutely.
So I'm postulating the fact that he went there with the intention to rob and with the intention to murder. Is that reasonable?
I think it is, and one sort of interpretation of that is that killing doesn't concern him or didn't concern him. He didn't have any negative emotional response to even the thought of killing.
Now, he's put a great deal of planning into this, and yet it doesn't seem to be particularly smart because he was always going to be the #1 suspect.
He was always going to be there or thereabouts. It seems, in a way, a senseless killing or a killing for killing's sake, just a means to an end.
Cook is now serving a life sentence in Reading Prison for murdering Beryl Maynard. Refusing to accept his guilt, he launches an appeal. But the court rejects it flat out, and he resigns himself to a life in prison. As a lifer, Cook is offered various rehabilitation programs.
So violent criminals get the same behavioural programs to teach them about, what the consequences of their violent behaviour. Because when you speak to lots of them, they don't understand the consequences of what they've done.
In order to get somebody to address their past patterns of behaviour, they really need to recognise their problematic behaviour. For somebody like this, we would be thinking probably they've been through a cognitive behavioural treatment programme, and probably the literature suggests that that wouldn't have had much impact.
All murderers automatically receive a life sentence and are given a minimum term that they must serve. Like most, Cook will eventually be able to apply for parole.
It will always be a question of hot debate whether if you take a life, you should lose your liberty forever. It's a complex issue, but, we're a civilised society. That's the way we approach things.
In 2021, there are only 60 whole-life prisoners in the UK.
It means what it says. You will remain in custody for the whole of your life. They're imposed rarely in this country and reserved for the truly gravest of offences.
Cook just needs to convince the parole board that he's cooperated with rehabilitation and is no longer a risk to the public. Parole boards are made up of experts including retired judges, probation officers, psychologists and police officers.
They can only act on the information given to them by probation, by the courses that they've undertaken, by the prisoners' behaviour in prison, what they've learnt about themselves.
Parole boards can be deceived by pathological liars like Cook. Around 17 years after he murdered Beryl, Cook convinces the board to start preparing him for release. By 2006, he's in the lowest category prison possible, HMP Prescoed, a Category D open prison in Usk, South Wales.
So an open prison is exactly what it says. It is somewhere where there's no locks, gates, bars, things that, they won't be locked in to anywhere or anything.
The idea is to slowly reintroduce Cook to the outside world. A great deal of trust is placed on the offender.
There is a period of time where you're allowed to go out. In the first case, you're supervised and then you're not supervised. And gives you the time to adjust. You can't put somebody in prison for X number of years and then just put them out the next day, because they really will struggle.
The impact of moving from closed to open conditions can't be overestimated. A lot of people really struggle with this, and particularly those with personality disorder or personality difficulties, because what those type of people need is containment. Actually, despite pushing back against rules, despite pushing back against boundaries, rules and boundaries make them feel quite safe.
Cook does not respond well to his new conditions. On June 17th, he fails to return to prison after being out on unsupervised temporary leave.
David Cook is branded a danger to the public during the week-long manhunt.
During his time on the run, Cook visits Bristol, Portsmouth and Reading, where he once again hands himself into police.
I think the fact that he absconded and then handed himself in is very interesting. He's gone outside, he's shown that he can break the rules and push the boundaries a bit, but now he'd like to come home, to be fed, to be watered, to be told what to do.
Cook is sent back to prison, but because he's not on a whole life tariff, he can reapply for parole. Late in 2009, despite his murder conviction and absconding from prison, he's finally released on life licence, having served 22 years.
A life licence is a licence literally for life. What it means is that there will be a period of time, which could be very substantial, where there will be requirements to see the probation officer, see a police officer, and if they do something, however trivial, if they do some shoplifting later on, the chances are they would be recalled to prison and start the process again.
After his release, Cook returns to the land of his birth. He starts out in a probation hostel in Cardiff and then moves to several other addresses in South Wales.
If they then want to move somewhere else, they haven't got the right to make that decision on their own. They have to apply, if they're on parole, to move to somewhere else. They have to make a case for it.
The real reason for Cook's frequent moves is that he's running up substantial debts and wants to escape his creditors by keeping one step ahead.
Cook has served 22 years and despite escaping from prison is now back in the community on licence. Just how effective could his rehabilitation prove to be? What are the prospects for rehabilitation of someone like this? You know, I mean, murder is a crime very few people ever repeat or ever even given the opportunity to repeat. So prison in respect of murderers usually works.
Most murders that occur are domestic murders and one-offs, and there is scope there for rehabilitation. What makes this different is his manipulation of somebody over a period of time that he didn't originally know. He ensured that he was invited into their whole family.
It seems to me that at some stage you'd have got a forensic diagnosis and an assessment in there, but he wasn't diagnosed with psychopathy, because otherwise that would have been a red flag to the parole board. So when the charming manipulator comes in front of them, they'd have been, received fair warning.
It is possible that he wasn't diagnosed through this time, and it's likely that he would have been introduced to offence-related programmes. He may have been seen by forensic psychologists. Whether they would pick up the extent of the risk and the problems in the way that he thinks would depend on how much he engaged with that assessment process.
What's interesting is that he manages to, 18 years into his sentence, he's put into an open prison.
I mean, I wonder whether he had been able to portray himself as someone who didn't present a risk, and whether there was not an institutional memory of the events that got him into prison and the serious risk that represented.
He absconds from an open prison. Mm-hmm. What's going through his mind? I mean, he knows he's likely going to get caught, and he's on the trajectory to get released permanently. Why would he abscond?
Quite often, prisoners can't cope in open conditions. I've come across that several times over the years, where it's too lax for them. It's too unregimented. It's too much personal responsibility. Eventually, after a week, I think he gave himself up. So he clearly had sorted out within himself the fact that it was ridiculous for him to carry on.
And yet, just 2 years later, he is released into the community.
Yes. So it raises questions in my mind about to what degree that episode was understood and taken into account in the subsequent risk assessment leading to his release from prison.
22 years after brutally murdering Beryl Maynard, Cook is living as a free man in South Wales. But tragically, this violent man would soon strike again. Unknown to his probation officer, Cook has racked up a huge debt of almost £6,000. And he's desperate to get away from the debtors who are after him. In 2011, Cook persuades probation to let him move to the small town of Rumney.
Rumney is a very small, close-knit community, and it is an area where everybody looks out for everybody else. Its people are very warm and welcoming and friendly, and if there is anybody new to the community, they would definitely welcome them.
Cook settles in a bungalow on Tanny Bryn, a quiet part of Rumney.
Cook seemed to fit in well in this small community, got on with people, and soon became a regular fixture in his local pub.
The first time I met David Cook was in Tredegar Arms, where we call it our local, because me and my husband always went there. David Cook came in one night, and he was talking, and he was so smart, and he was really tidy, you know, and smart. And I looked up and I thought, he looks all right, but the barkeeper, Lynn, always thought there was something wrong, because she used to say, there's something wrong with him, Val.
David's neighbour in Tanny Bryn is long-term resident Leonard Hill, a quiet, reserved man who lives alone.
As long as I can remember, Len lived in 52 Tanny Bryn. I used to see him, because I used to go for a walk regular, and he was always out in the garden, and I used to say, hello, Len, and you wouldn't get conversation out of him because he was so quiet, you know.
Leonard Hill suffers from mental health issues for which he receives help at a local support centre.
Everybody liked him up there, because he's very helpful and he was a nice man.
Cook passes himself off as a friendly neighbour. Is he reformed, or is this just one more trick to try and steal some money? From his perspective, how difficult would it be for him to reintegrate and engage and, you know, on a day-to-day basis, emotionally reintegrate with society?
So it's a significant step. So to move from a life within an institution where everything is regimented to suddenly being in the community where he has to take the initiative, that would be a significant step for anyone, including him.
So it stands out that he appears to have little or no friends or family from his previous life.
I think that is where his psychological flaw is, that I don't think he has the capacity to form strong emotional attachments to other people, and relationships are transactional with a view to what he can gain from those relationships.
And he seems to have integrated reasonably well in the community. He's got a local pub, he's well known there, he can pop down there and have a pint.
Yes, he can, and people are not judging him, and there is no suggestion that there's anything untoward at this stage.
Of course, the difficulty with this is that this kind of socialisation is exactly the kind of skill and which was presented as a precursor to his previous crimes, which was kind of engaging, being friendly, and seducing people into a criminal opportunity.
Yes, absolutely. He's an A-star student in the art of manipulation and of coercing people to be his friends.
Is the probation service, you know, expecting and hoping that these criminal tendencies and this aggression, he's burnt out? He's nearly, he's beyond middle age now, and the worst is behind him.
Yes, I think that's very likely. I think it's likely to have been the assumption that he's aged, there may be a assumed process of maturity, and that he no longer presents the risk that he once did. So
he appeared to have befriended a neighbour, and likely because he had access to cash. And so his friendship and that process of engagement was as a casing him to rob him.
Yes, I believe so. I think that was at the forefront of his mind, particularly as he was being chased himself to clear his debts.
Unbeknownst to his probation team, the pressure on Cook is mounting. He desperately needs to pay back £5,800 of debt, and he plots a way to get hold of the money. Cook has befriended a vulnerable neighbour, Leonard Hill. On June 14th, Cook lures Leonard to his house, supposedly for a friendly cup of coffee.
David and Leonard was friendly. I wouldn't say they were good friends, but I mean, it's like me talking to my neighbour, that type of thing, like. And what I can gather is that he had phoned Leonard, Cook did, and he must have asked him to go in because Len went in there.
Leonard Hill expects nothing more than to enjoy a drink with his friend. When, just as with Beryl Maynard, Cook launches a savage attack from out of nowhere.
Cook strangles him with a television power flex cable.
He hides Leonard's body in a bedroom.
Cook buried Mr. Hill under cushions and old carpets.
David Cook ransacks Hill's bungalow, stealing his wallet and anything else he could potentially sell. He then calmly heads to the pub for a pint with the locals.
The day he killed Leonard, he came out that night to the Tredegar Arms. He had all scratches down his cheek, and he reckoned that he parted two boys that was fighting. And of course we believed him, because we thought he was a proper gentleman, like.
In the days that follow, Cook carries on life as normal, making no effort to dispose of Leonard's body that's hidden in a bedroom.
2 days after the murder of Mr. Hill, Cook was visited by his probation officer, who visited him at his home, unaware that Mr. Hill's body was in that house. Cook had stolen some DVDs and a watch from Mr. Hill's home and asked his probation officer for a lift to Caerphilly town, where he then sold those possessions for £13.88 at a local cash generator shop.
Leonard's body lies undiscovered under cushions, while Cook starts to lose his nerve and flees the village.
Cook initially heads to a bed and breakfast in Cardiff. Locals, meanwhile, notice that Leonard is missing from their community.
Leonard Hill, he attended a daycare centre, and it was those people there who first alerted the authorities when he didn't attend.
Leonard Hill is reported missing on June 21st, having not been seen for a week.
When somebody's reported missing, they're assessed into different kind of levels. So Mr. Hill would be assessed, I would imagine, as a high-risk missing person because of his vulnerability, because of his age.
Police go to Leonard's house, which is locked and empty, with clear signs that Leonard did not intend to leave for long.
The day that David Cook, nasty man, David Cook murdered him. He had just come back from shopping because all his shopping was in the passage.
They also called David Cook on his cell phone to ask if he knows where his neighbour might be. Cook professes ignorance and tells them he's at a family funeral to explain his absence. Then he quickly relocates to Swansea.
David Cook is on the run after strangling and robbing his neighbour. But why not just steal to pay off your debts? How come it ended in murder? He doesn't seem to be reflecting any kind of devious or dangerous patterns of behaviour here. All the signals he's sending out to law enforcement, to probation, are the appropriate ones. And then something dramatic happens, again out of the blue.
Well, it appears that he had debts that nobody knew about. He didn't inform his probation officer about the debts that he'd run up. So going back to when he used the murder of Beryl to rob her, unfortunately, this was on the cards again.
His neighbour appears to be rather vulnerable, and this is now a bit of a pattern.
Well, that's right. That significant relationships to him are transactional with a view to personal gain, material gain, and he's more likely to achieve that material gain if he identifies vulnerable victims.
What kind of person can commit murder, but then go to a local pub as if nothing had happened?
Well, I think now we're seeing signs of psychopathy, which are likely to have been there throughout, but it's becoming more evident. Someone who is not concerned about the very serious consequences of their actions, the effect on others and the harm that he causes others. And that is reinforced by the fact that he can just go about his business without appearing distressed or concerned about what's happened.
And even more extraordinarily, his probation or support officer comes to his house and for a regular appointment, and they chit-chat away without any hint of suspicion.
No, he makes it. This is 2 days later, so 2 days after the murder. He's covered up the body of Leonard with some cushions. The support worker comes in, he sits down, has a cup of tea with Cook. Cook is very chatty. There is no indication whatsoever that there's anything amiss.
And what I kind of said, why did he not just rob his neighbour rather than, why did he feel the need to strangle him? Because presumably he could have robbed the neighbour when the neighbour was out.
He could have done, and this again raises questions about whether there is another gain for him from killing. I mean, but it could be that he, even though he is will be the likely suspect, that he is trying to cover his tracks.
An innocent man lies dead and undiscovered in Cook's house while he's fled the area. How long before the police connect the missing pensioner with his murderous neighbour?
Police first became aware that Cook was the killer of Mr. Hill when Cook called his probation worker 12 days after the murder. He left a voicemail and said, "I've done something terrible, I've killed my neighbour," and that he would be at Swansea railway station waiting. That's where police found him and arrested him on suspicion of murder.
That evening, police discover Leonard's badly decomposed body under the pillows and carpets in Cook's home.
Oh, I was devastated because he was such a nice fella.
I'm very interested in his decision to sort of half-heartedly hide the body and have a probation officer into the home where he's hiding this body. It's clear that he likes to be caught almost. He likes to be found out. He's asking to be found out, and ultimately he knows that will result in him returning to prison, which is, I suggest, probably where he feels most comfortable.
Cook goes on trial on April 19th, 2012 in Newport Crown Court. True to form, his defence was that the killing was manslaughter, and he again tries to shift the blame onto his victim.
Cook claimed Mr. Hill had made sexual advances towards him.
Cook claims, as he did in the Beryl Maynard case, that he reacted defensively without thinking. But no one believes Cook.
The judge described Cook as a pathological liar without scruples.
The real motive, prosecutors reveal, is the same as it's always been with Cook: money to clear his debts. In an unusual move, the judge allows Cook's murderous past and his violent and devious methods to be revealed to the court.
The jury took just over an hour to come to the conclusion that Cook did indeed murder Mr. Hill. That is a very fast verdict.
At 65, David Cook is sentenced to a whole life term, joining the small group of violent offenders that will never be released from prison.
I was very relieved that David Cook was charged with the murder and had jail for life. Thank God we can sleep at night.
Rumney residents start a collection to give Leonard Hill a fitting send-off with lots of flowers.
The community of Rumney felt angry at what had happened. And writing and reporting on the case, it certainly left me with a lot of questions as to how things could go so drastically wrong.
Just how do you stop a manipulative liar with no moral compass who escalates to extreme violence without warning or provocation? This is now his second murder, and he must know that his time on the run is going to be limited.
He must. The question in my mind is whether that really concerned him, whether he suffers the sort of emotional effects of this sort of behaviour.
So, you know, there's a case to be made that although he needed money to pay a debt, actually, maybe the stronger driver was he wanted to return to prison.
It could well be that was where he felt most comfortable.
There's a lot going on in Cook's head here. What is your suspicion about a psychopathic diagnosis?
So I think the evidence is building up that he's showing signs of psychopathy. I think it's also clear, and this was mentioned in the sentencing remarks, that he was a pathological liar. So he found it easy to give a false account of what he had done and what he was planning to do.
In this instance, he gave the false account by saying that Leonard tried to make sexual advances towards him, which is why he pleaded guilty to manslaughter, which wasn't accepted by the jury.
What weight do you put onto his efforts to get a manslaughter plea across the line rather than a murder conviction?
So it suggests to me that he's prepared to attempt to falsely besmirch the reputation of the victim for his own gain.
Where along this terrible journey could this crime have been prevented?
So the point which I would be particularly interested in understanding is the response to his absconsion from the Oakham prison. So it raises questions about his the degree to which he was complying with the supervision regime and the degree to which he was going to remain offence-free in the future. So that certainly would need exploring.
I look back and I wonder, with the early sentences, with the when he bound and gagged an 80-year-old man and there was other violence and other offences, that might have afforded an opportunity for a different intervention and maybe a different outcome.
I think, you know, one of the things, once he'd robbed Leonard's house, he actually got his probation officer to give him a lift into town so he could sell some of the stuff that he'd stolen from the bungalow. And it just never ceases to amaze me, the cold, callousness, clinical ways that murderers behave.
David Cook clearly learned very little from his various stints in prison. Each time he secured his freedom, he quickly resorted to violence to meet his ends. Cook hid his psychopathic tendencies from the authorities, and as a consequence, he slipped through the safety net and was tragically released to kill again.
In December 2020, David Cook contracts COVID-19 in prison. He dies on Christmas Eve. Cook has spent the last years of his life in HMP Franklin, a Category A prison in County Durham that houses some of the country's most notorious killers. In his wasted life, he robbed 2 innocent families of their loved ones.